So over the 1500s, as churches got richer, they would have more and more extravagant musical events. And these eventually got to the point where they featured multiple choirs and lots of instruments. Towards the end of the 1500s, there's a new style called concerto style, Concerto. And this had voices and instruments together, and together is the meaning of the word concerto. And the voices and the instruments had their own independent parts. And an important aspect of these kinds of compositions was the interplay of timbres and different instruments and voices. During these big musical events, the organ would just sort of play everything, the vocal parts and the instrumental parts, just as best they could. And they did this because they were the only instrument that could do this, but also to help keep the ensemble together. This was tough for organists. This was not an easy task for organists to play all of these parts all at the same time. So just before 1600, a publisher of a collection of pieces for a varied number of voices. So it could be, full choir of 4 parts or just a single solo vocal part. This publisher made things easier for the organist by offering a separate part just for them. And it was a streamlined version of the music that just had the bass note, the bass line, and then below those bass lines would be written numbers. They gave you information about or numbers and other symbols. They gave you information about the intervals above the bass, but didn't actually give you notes above the bass to play. This let the organist sort of fill in the rest of the parts kind of at their own discretion. So if you had a big choir, the organist didn't need to add a lot. They could just kind of keep everyone in tune and everyone together. But if you only had 1 or 2 vocal parts, then the organist could improvise a more elaborate accompaniment to make it sound fancier and more interesting. You can see examples of this kind of notation in almost every excerpt that we'll talk about this semester. And turning this notation into music is called realization. The bass line with added information was referred to in the publication that I was talking about as continuous bass, or translated into Italian, basso continuo. Continuo, we also call it figured bass because the numbers are the figures. Now, this may seem only important to organists, but it actually had a huge impact on music. So in an earlier video, I talked about the equality of voices in Renaissance music. Also, in earlier music, they didn't really think about harmony as its own thing. What we call harmonies, like a dominant triad or a tonic triad, they were side effects of how lines moved. And, composers before 1600 or so didn't really, for them, the idea of chord progressions didn't really exist. But in the Baroque period, with monody, there was an emphasis on a single voice line, usually the highest sounding one. And the emphasis on monody lined up perfectly with this new technique of figured bass, because music with one voice could still sound full and rich because the keyboard could fill in the harmonies. And with figured bass, this is the first time in music in the literate tradition where harmony had functioned, had its own function, as opposed to just being sort of a byproduct of counterpoint rules. So now, in this time period, starting around 1600, harmony starts to have a life of its own. And one of the big stories of this semester is composers realizing that the thing that drove a piece didn't have to be counterpoint or even words. It could just be harmonic progressions, like this one. Which is a nice little idea on its own, and a later composer turned it into this. And we'll get into more detail about that when that particular composer shows up. By the way, when I was talking about the ideas that Rameau wrote down in his book in the previous video, this is what he was writing about, this new harmony stuff. So the emergence of harmony as an independent element of music allows instrumental music, music without words, to get bigger and more complex, and eventually gives us stuff like Beethoven's symphonies.
This new understanding of harmony meant that continuo, figured bass, is basically in all of the music from this time period, with the exception of music for solo keyboard. So Taruskin suggests calling this time period the Age of Continuo. So this was the last video. At this point, you should take the quiz. You're free to use your notes. You can even rewatch the videos while you do it. The one thing is that you must answer the questions in your own words. You can't just use what I said. Good luck, and let's have a final cat check-in. They finally chilled out. Here we got Charles. Charles. Hello. And over here, Rebecca Jordan, also known as Newt. See you all soon.